So I see some of you who have already visited Kino Border Initiative or have emailed me. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Kino Border Initiative, we're a binational organization in Nogales, Sonora and Nogales, Arizona. We try to respond to the needs of migrants here through humanitarian aid, education, and research and advocacy. So I'm going to draw broad strokes, kind of the national picture, even a few pieces that maybe aren't directly related to the situation of people at the border, because obviously the immigration advocacy that'll happen post-teach-in will be on a broader level.
So is that where the sound comes in? Okay.
Joanna, I apologize. I think I just muted you one more time. What's your area code?
Mine is 602. Are they talking to me?
I don't know. Can you hear me now, Kim?
There you go. Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So this is actually a little bit challenging to talk about the situation because we are a couple of weeks away from an election, if you haven't heard. And when we're doing our advocacy day, it'll be post-election. So I wanted to start out just by drawing a couple of possible election scenarios that, of course, I wrote this last week, and a lot has changed in the last week. But there's a few possibilities that we could face on the Monday after Election Day when we're all on the Hill. One would be a Clinton administration, which would likely want to act pretty quickly on putting together some sort of larger immigration bill, a comprehensive immigration reform as it's called. But probably in that process would be willing to make many concessions on the security front. So I'll talk a little bit about this over the course of the presentation, but comprehensive immigration reform is something that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and it's important to have clear what do we want within that context. So that's if Hillary Clinton wins the election. If the Trump administration, if Donald Trump wins the election, he's likely to use some form of executive action, particularly to increase deportation, and he probably would request congressional support to fund more border security measures and other internal security. With the Clinton administration and the Democratic Senate, it's likely that a larger package of bills would be slightly more favorable. A Democratic Senate and a Trump administration could perhaps block some of the anti-immigrant proposals of a Trump administration. If the Senate stays Republican, margins are also going to matter. So it's possible that it's likely actually with a Republican Senate that a Clinton administration would still try to put together a comprehensive package of bills. We'll just have to make that more security focused in the process. And a Republican Senate would potentially allow a Trump administration to pass more anti-immigrant proposals. So actually the Senate is likely where some of those proposals would die, whereas they would probably get through the House. And then finally, it's pretty likely that the House will remain in Republican control. So if we want to play out this entire scenario, if we had a Clinton administration, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican House, in 2013, there was Obama administration, Democratic Senate, and a Republican House. And the mentality was that the House would have to accept a Senate immigration bill if it passed by a wide enough margin. And that didn't work in 2013. It's unlikely to work in 2017. So probably the first step in any sort of larger bill would be starting in the House with some sort of package of individual bills, and then the Senate take up those bills, come up with a Senate version, and then have some level of unity between the two measures. So, like I said, by the time we're at the teach-in, we'll know which of these scenarios is actually the case. But in the meantime, we have to prepare for different possibilities. I'm going to play out a little bit more the Clinton administration scenario, and then in the end, take up a Trump administration scenario. Not that, we're necessarily advancing particular political candidates, but it's more likely that there will be a comprehensive discussion under a Clinton administration. So if indeed Hillary Clinton wins the election, there's this push for a comprehensive immigration reform. The details are not going to be worked out by the Monday after the election. This moment on Monday after election is a very important moment for us to push forward a clear message of what our ideal would be. So we're not in the negotiation stage of what are the details of that bill. This is our chance to stake out the moral high ground and say, what do we as a church, what do we, from our Jesuit values, really want to be communicated in this bill? So using phrases like a church beyond borders, the idea of mercy, since we'll still be in the year of mercy, talking about immigration in the context of why do people immigrate? So people who are on the move to seek protection for their human rights, like economic security and safety. Getting to some of these core ideas of migration that are sometimes lost once we get into the more political debate and the, as I say, the sausage making or the details of policy. But we won't be in that space quite yet on Monday after election. A couple of phrases just to caution against. Oftentimes when we talk about some sort of comprehensive bill, there's a lot of talk about, well, we'll focus on deporting the criminals. Or as President Obama has said, we'll deport felons, not families. This isn't necessarily the moment to draw those distinctions. This is the moment to talk about human dignity, the decriminalization of immigration, and eventually those conversations will be had. I'll bring this up a little bit later. Eventually those conversations will be had about what will be some of those exclusions. But focusing on human beings as human beings is a good first step in advocacy. And then the second phrase that's going to come up a lot in the next year and has come up in plenty in the last couple of decades is this idea of securing the border. But just because that phrase exists out there doesn't mean that we have to use it. There's a couple of other things that you can say about the border, like how do we promote vibrant border communities? What about respecting human rights and human dignity at the border, or creating an accountable border? Those are things that we would be able to say in these meetings that wouldn't necessarily reinforce the same message of there's something we need to be afraid of, we need to look for security. That idea will come up plenty in 2017. We have a chance to stake out some different ground here in November. So on the note of creating this clear message of the ideal, there's a lot of talk about comprehensive immigration reform, and that can mean a range of very pro-enforcement legislation. There's some different combinations. So from our messaging perspective, comprehensive immigration reform might not inherently be a moral good because it depends on what comprehensive means. What are the pieces of that puzzle? So my encouragement would actually be talking about this larger pack of immigration bills as something that we want to be compassionate and holistic. So compassionate to different people's needs and a holistic approach to addressing different issues on immigration. Just again, to be able to talk about our values related to what would go into that bill. This compassionate, holistic immigration reform, if it does indeed come up in post-election, would probably have 4 different components. I'm going to go through some of the details of each of those 4 components. One would be some form of a path to citizenship. The second would be some amount of change in the legal immigration system, so what are legal means to immigrate to the United States. The third would be an enforcement section, which would include border enforcement and interior enforcement. And then the fourth is some possibilities of addressing detention, due process, asylum, other aspects of the immigration system. So I'm going to walk through a little bit what some of the priorities we could push for in each of those 4 dimensions will be. And a lot of this references some of the talking points and background material that you can find on the Ignatian Solidarity website. So the first is the path to citizenship. A few values to promote there. One would be that it's accessible and in a reasonable amount of time. Oftentimes that path to citizenship in a larger bill gets tied to triggers of, well, we have to first secure the border and then people can become citizens. And those triggers can push that process back 5, 10 years even. So we have the chance to push for it, saying let's have a reasonable amount of time in which people without legal status could become citizens. Second consideration of the path to citizenship is going to be who's excluded from that process. So the 2013 bill, a lot of people said, this is legislation that would legalize 11 million individuals in the United States. That's simply not true based on how the legislation was written. It maybe would have provided a path to citizenship for 5 to 6 million of the total 11 million who are in the country. So we have a chance to push for minimizing the grounds of those exclusions from this path to citizenship. And actually the fact that we're advocating both on criminal justice and on immigration reform is a really unique opportunity to talk about how do we start with human dignity and then worry about some other realities of this person's situation. For example, historically, any sort of drug-related offense has generally excluded someone from consideration for this path to citizenship. But when we're advocating for criminal justice reform and a more humane approach to people with drug offenses, well, maybe also there should be some forgiveness in the immigration context, just to put that idea out there. Maybe that isn't inherently an opportunity to exclude someone from a path to citizenship. And then the third piece that's important to remember is to push for citizenship, not just legal status. If we are pushing for people just to get some form of legal status, but without ever being able to become full U.S. citizens, what we're doing is creating a two-class society, which in a way is perpetuating some of the inequalities that already exist. So oftentimes when a comprehensive bill comes up, elements of it are, bills don't just emerge in Capitol Hill from scratch. The elements are always drawn on from previous legislation. So to give you a little bit of idea of some of the previous bills that probably will get put into this path to citizenship part, many of you are already familiar with the DREAM Act. That's likely to get almost copied and pasted into a larger bill. There's also a bill called HR 2095, called the American Families United Act, that would increase discretion for immigration judges to cancel removal based on the fact that family separation is an inherent hardship. It would take me another 30 minutes to explain some of the policies on immigration judge discretion, but suffice to say that in 1996, a lot of that discretion was taken away from immigration judges. And some immigration legislation in 2017 might be an opportunity to increase that discretion. And then the third piece of legislation that probably will influence whatever happens in 2017 is S744, or the 2013 version of comprehensive reform. It had a path to citizenship with a fast track for Dreamers, but it had a 10-year wait for any form of permanent immigration status, and it had a lot of restrictions on eligibility or exclusions, and then it had some of those triggers. So we don't necessarily want to promote S744 in and of itself, but rather recognize what was good about it and what was less ideal. The second element of any sort of overall reform would be a change in our legal immigration system. So we, from the idea of Jesuit values and the Catholic social teaching, do put priority on family reunification visas, that there should be ways for families to come back together through our legal immigration process, and that be somewhat reasonable time-wise, not a 25-year wait. For any kind of temporary worker program, that there needs to be clear oversight of working conditions. So previous visa programs have really exposed workers to abuses because there's very limited oversight of the conditions in which they're working. and those visas are tied to employers. So if somebody speaks out against abuses, it's very easy for them to lose their visa. A third element for visa allotment is that there's ways to design a temporary program where it stays temporary, and in that case, since we're kicking the can down the road, we're creating a future group of potentially undocumented people in the country or second-class individuals. So we get pushed instead for a temporary program with an option to have some sort of permanent legal status at the end. And then the fourth consideration for visa allotments in the legal immigration system is what's called unlawful presence bars, which is people who have previously lived in the U.S. without legal authorization are sometimes then excluded from accessing any form of legal status for 5 or 10 years. And it would be possible to waive some of these bars or eliminate them altogether in kind of immigration legislation. So S744, again, had a lot to say about these particular aspects. The good news was that it raised the per-country ceiling for family reunification visas. It did provide a way for some people with temporary low-skilled work visas to later become permanent immigrants. And it eased some of the requirements of waiving this unlawful presence bar. The bad news is that it reduced the number of family reunification visas. It eliminated actually the entire sibling category for family reunification, and it capped the age at which adult married children could request reunification. So it's important in our visits to bring up the good as an example of what we'd like to be incorporated, but push back against the possibility that some of the bad proposals will come back up and say, actually, we think that the number of family reunification visas should be increased and not reduced, or the category should be kept the same, some form of that language. The third aspect of bill will be enforcement provisions. So a few positive things to push for. One would be Border Patrol oversight and training. So we found in our surveys that 1 out of every 3 migrants who are crossing the border and detained by Border Patrol suffer some form of abuse. So there's clearly a need for better training and better oversight of those agents. Second aspect that we could push for in legislation would be ending what's called the consequence delivery system. This system is a combination of policies that is written in the principle of making people suffer for having crossed the border so that then they might not cross again. But what the result is that it really erodes people's rights and increases their vulnerability. One aspect of the consequence delivery system is that people are tried for illegal entry and re-entry when they go back. So those are treated as criminal offenses, and people are prosecuted for them and made to accept plea bargains and then sent to jail for many months just for the simple act of crossing the border. Again, that's a point of intersection with the criminal justice advocacy that we'll do as part of these visit days. So we're trying to reduce people who are in jail for certain offenses. Why not also reduce the number of people who are jailed for just crossing the border? And then the third aspect is to emphasize family unity and safe deportation practices at the border. So 65% of individuals who cross the border with immediate family members are separated from those family members, in large part because of this consequence delivery system that sends people to different ports of entry to be deported, send people to different amounts of jail time. So what we can say in our advocacy visits is we want to make sure that family unity is prioritized. There's a lot of examples of good and bad legislation on this. A couple of good bills. One is the Border Enforcement Oversight Accountability Community Engagement Act, which would increase training and set up a better complaints and discipline process. The Protect Family Values at the Border Act would also emphasize this consideration of family unity and would also improve conditions in short-term detention at the border. Some very bad examples of legislation. One is what's called the Corker-Hoven Amendment, which was in this 2013 bill and would have doubled the number of Border Patrol agents and tripled criminal prosecution of people who are crossing the border, amongst many other issues. What we don't want is for that to be the starting point for a 2017 immigration reform. We want to have this humane, human rights and human dignity approach to the border, not a gut reaction of we have to immediately increase agent presence or we have to prosecute more people for the crime of crossing the border. So it's important to bring up what we do want at the border, like these first two pieces of legislation. And then the fourth legislation that's very problematic, likely to come back up, is case law. That there's a lot of background I could explain about that. You can look it up. But it would establish a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for illegal re-entry. So again, contradicting some of the progress that has been made on the criminal justice reform side in terms of eliminating these mandatory minimums. The second aspect of enforcement is going to be some proposals related to interior enforcement. So we can push for an appropriate implementation of the E-Verify system. E-Verify is a way that employers are able to tell whether someone is legally allowed to work. It's likely that that's going to be it's almost certain it's going to be part of a bill. It's one of the more popular aspects of immigration reform. But it's important that that implementation include protections so that people who are wrongfully found ineligible, who the system says, no, that actually person doesn't have the right to work, have a way to appeal or fix the issue within the database. Because it's actually not, the technology isn't actually ready for widespread use and has a lot of glitches in it. And then the second would be reducing federal cooperation with local authorities. So there's a couple different dimensions of this. There used to be what's called the Secure Community Program that was meant to target people who have committed crimes, but actually meant that anyone who's fingerprinted into jail had their immigration status checked, and then ICE would put what they called detainers on those individuals, or would ask the jail to hold them extra time so that ICE could come and take custody. President Obama has replaced that with the Priority Enforcement Program. It's a little unclear what the difference is at this moment. Another consideration of what's called 287G agreements, where local authorities, particularly now in jails, are deputized to do federal immigration enforcement. So they're vested with the power from Immigration and Customs Enforcement to say, you can look up someone's immigration status. We might have the opportunity to say, we'd actually like to end 287G agreements. We want that to be included in immigration legislation. Then the third piece is that there's a lot of cities at local level who have refused to comply with Secure Communities, now Priority Enforcement Program, and who have refused to take 287G agreements. They're called sanctuary cities. So there's then been a backlash in Congress against sanctuary cities, which has resulted in the Stop Sanctuary Cities Act that would prohibit those cities from receiving certain federal grants for economic development. That's, again, a piece of legislation that will probably come up, especially in the House version of the bill, that we want to be able to push back against. And the same with this Empowering Local Law Enforcement Act that would make it mandatory that local law enforcement have immigration enforcement authority. And just a note on E-Verify, the 2013 version of comprehensive reform would have mandated the use of E-Verify, but also did have these processes for appeals and access to information. So it's pretty reasonably structured in the old version of the legislation. And probably something similar will come up in this new version. The final part to touch on, which I would love to spend a couple hours on, is due process detention and asylum, which is also likely to be a component of different parts of the bill. One thing we could ask for is increased access to attorneys. So only about 37% of immigrants have attorneys, and only about 14% of those who are in detention. And having an attorney makes an enormous difference in whether someone's able to win their case or not, because immigration law is so complicated. So one of the asks we can have in our congressional visits is that there be an increased access to those attorneys, because they're not guaranteed under federal law, unlike in criminal court. And the second would be to expand alternatives to detention and end the detention bed mandate. So right now, every year in our funding bill, ICE is mandated to have 34,000 detention beds. And that means that a lot of people are unnecessarily detained because there's a space for them in a bed. And people spend an average of a year in detention without bail. So a lot of physical, emotional impacts on that. And also financial costs from a taxpayer perspective. I obviously care about the physical, emotional, and psychological effects, but your congressperson might also care that it costs $159 to detain a person for a day, and between 17 cents and $17 to use an alternative to detention. They're just fiscally irresponsible to have so many detention beds. A couple of good bills that hopefully would be incorporated. One is the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act that would mandate that unaccompanied kids and other vulnerable individuals receive legal representation, and if necessary, at the government's expense. There's also the Justice is Not for Sale Act that would eliminate this detention bed mandate, this $34,000 bed number. And then a very problematic bill is the Asylum Reform and Border Protection Act of 2015, which would prohibit the government from paying for attorneys, restrict access to the asylum process, detain people for longer, and restrict who's considered as an unaccompanied child. So we need to be aware that some of those elements from that act might come back up, again, especially in the House version of overall legislation. So some of you walk in to your visits and you want to push these particular values along these 4 lines, but we might have a senator or representative who's actually very friendly to most of these proposals. So there's more that you can do outside of just saying, would you support these proposals within a bill? Because some of you have senators or representatives who are likely to already do that. A few other asks that you could do, one would be to include these things in the appropriations process, or what's the funding process for the government. So whether or not we have this compassionate, holistic immigration reform in 2017, we could, a senator or representative could be proactive in including an end to the detention bed mandate in the funding bill, providing more funding for immigration judges or for immigration lawyers, hiring people who aren't directly tied to Border Patrol to do medical and social services here at the border, rather than having Border Patrol agents without good medical or social services training, and improving the complaints and investigation process. Those are all things that could happen through the funding process. So you could ask your senator or representative to what we call champion or push for it. The second aspect can be to ask your congressional office to encourage the administration to use their power for good. So friendly congressional offices could be great allies to create pressure for the administration to use more alternatives to detention. That's a discretionary decision and doesn't necessarily require legislation. It could be some sort of temporary protection for particular groups. Right now, for example, to not deport Haitians back to Haiti post-hurricane and post-earthquake and with cholera and all of that. That's something the administration could decide. And Congress people could pressure the administration to do. A third would be that training and oversight aspect. Deciding not to prosecute asylum seekers could be the decision by the Attorney General, and having people, senators and representatives, interested in contacting the president about that might make it more likely that the Attorney General would reduce those prosecutions. And then finally, the prioritization of family unity. So that's the overall possibility of if we have a Clinton administration, if we have some form of good bills, or some possibility for good bills to move through Congress. Just to touch briefly on if we did have a Trump administration who would likely use their executive action, you can still ask your senators and representatives to slow down some of this increase in deportations by limiting funding or not increasing funding, because it takes personnel to deport immigrants. So there's ways that Congress could slow down that process. And then the second is that the representatives could advocate against negative legislation, like some of the examples that I already mentioned. So all is not lost either way, but I think there's more creative potential if we really are talking about a larger 2017 conversation about immigration. So that's, and I just wanted to mention some of these resources as well, if you want more information. And I think now we have a time for questions.
Thanks, Joanna. I am going to unmute everyone on the call right now. So I'm doing it right now. If you want to remute yourself, feel free to do that via your phone. But when you ask a question, please just share your name and where you're calling from, and feel free to ask Joanna some questions. One more quick note, if your sound is not working, feel free to use the chat function as well, and I can relay those questions that are sent via chat.
Hey, Kim.
Yeah.
Kim, this is Phil Skelton from St. John's Jesuit.
Hi, Phil.
I'm here with a number of my students. A question for you is, I think you emailed us to say that this information is going to be put online like next week, her presentation?
Yep, it'll be up by, at the latest Friday, next Friday, but I think it'll be much earlier in the week.
Okay, and that will be on Solidarity Network's page?
Yeah, it'll be on the Teach-In Advocacy Day page, but I'll also send a reminder email to everyone who participated in this conference with the link.
Okay, thank you.
Joanna, this is Brian Galligan. I'm calling from Canisius High School. I have a question about the asylum process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So could you kind of walk us through what it looks like for asylum seekers coming through over the southern border, and maybe how that's different from other borders?
Yeah, so there's there's 6 different possibilities. It's a very different process depending on whether a person is a single adult, a family unit, so a mom and kids generally, or what's called an unaccompanied child, which could be somebody who is traveling with a family member but not an immediate family member. So a single adult who's coming across the southern border, whether they're detained or they decide to present themselves as what is called a port of entry, will face several months in detention. Here in Arizona, almost always at least 6 months in detention as they start the asylum process. So they have to go first through what's called a credible fear hearing, which is to see if they have a 10% chance of eventually winning their case. And then they go through several court dates with an immigration judge. And if somebody doesn't manage to get released from detention, either because they're denied bond or their bond is very high, here our average bond is about $15,000, which is almost impossible for most families to pay, then they can spend about 1.5 years going through that entire immigration court process while still in detention. That's the single adult case, which is actually the worst case scenario. Families who are coming across the southern border sometimes will be immediately released, generally with an ankle bracelet to monitor where they are, and that's called an alternative to detention. And then they can rejoin family members across the country, and then they start the immigration court process. Then they'll have particular court dates they have to show up to prove their asylum claim. And then the third category would be an unaccompanied minor, who would then be brought to an Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter until a qualifying family member is found. So they, in a sense, are in the foster system at that point. And will be in that shelter unless they have a relative that can receive them, in which case they would reunite with that relative as they continue to go through the court process. And a really important thing to know about asylum, for those of you who aren't familiar, is that asylum isn't just given because someone is afraid or could be killed, but it's very particular grounds that someone has to prove persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So that's where it becomes really tricky in immigration law, is how do you make sure you fit into that category? The judge needs to not just certify that you're under threat, but that you're under threat because you belong to a protected class. Does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
That does answer my question. Thank you. I remember a lot of stuff in the news back in, I guess, last year and then 2014 about unaccompanied minors and the state of those shelters. Is that still problematic, or what is the situation with that now?
Actually, we think that the fiscal year 2016 numbers, which I don't think we have the final numbers yet for fiscal year 2016, it's likely that we're almost at the same level as 2014. It just hasn't made the news quite as much. So in response to 2014, the U.S. government funded a lot of Mexican border enforcement. But because of reasons of violence in Central America, people continue to come up. And now we're at almost the same level. And we have a lot of kids coming over in Texas and Arizona. Not necessarily something good to mention to your senator or representative if there's somebody who's then going to panic and propose a lot of bad bills. But something important to keep in mind of this is an ongoing situation, continues to be a lot of people in shelters. OR's process has improved. There's always room for improvement and always needed for more funding to receive those kids.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, who is it?
My name is Milano, from St. John's Jesuit High School in Toledo. I was just curious as to if you have or know of a personal story of any of this being implemented on hand.
Yeah, I have lots of stories. What particular aspect are you curious about?
More specifically, to the this right here, the asylum process and detention.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, I have a friend who was fleeing from El Salvador because she is lesbian, and so she was being persecuted for her sexual orientation. And she spent almost a year and a half in detention and was denied bond several times and almost gave up many, many times, even though she would likely be killed if she returned to El Salvador. And eventually was granted a $15,000 bond. It took an entire community effort to get her out of detention, but she suffered pretty terrible conditions. She actually organized a hunger strike while she was still in detention because of lack of access to medical care, because of the psychological pressure of being in detention. And she's somebody who is likely to win in her asylum case, but for a year and a half we paid money to keep her in detention because we thought she was a threat.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Joanna, we've got a chat question from the St. Peter's University group. They're wondering what structures and systems for accountability there are in place now for Border Patrol agents, and what specific improvements could be made to that system as part of our advocacy for increased or improved Border Patrol training.
Yeah, that's a great question. All of your questions are exactly on the issues that I care the most about. So Border Patrol right now, one of the challenges is that there isn't necessarily a straight, clear oversight or accountability structure. But what does exist is what's called the Office of Professional Management within Customs and Border Protection. They're the ones who are supposed to receive complaints and make recommendations on discipline. There's been a survey or a couple of studies by law enforcement professionals that have said one of the problems was that Border Patrol the number of Border Patrol agents doubled between 2007 and 2012, but the staff at the Office of Professional Management didn't increase. So it's like if you had, if you're a teacher, instead of having 30 students in your class, you have 60 students in the class. So one very clear recommendation would be to double the number of Office of Professional Management staff so that they can respond to these complaints. Another recommendation is to develop a clear, transparent complaints process. So when I file complaints against Border Patrol, I have to file them in 3 different places, and I never know whether those complaints are even investigated. So that one clear recommendation would be for there to be a single system in which complaints can go in, and then a way to track the progress of complaints, so that we know, does that have any impact? What are some of the changes that are made in response to that complaint? And then and I think the training is also an important issue in oversight, that then training be adapted based on what complaints are coming in.
Hi, everyone. This is Memphis from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California. One of our students here actually has a question, and his name is Ishmael Matambura.
Yeah, my question is, I mean, there are two questions, actually. The first one is related to sort of a fear that sometimes the immigration creates in the minds of people. So I don't know how that can be addressed in terms of, because people are a little bit afraid of losing their job opportunities in welcoming others. So that's the first question. The second one is, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the Cates law that you talked about earlier on.
What was the second question again?
Is just to elaborate a little more on Cates law.
Oh, on Cates law. Cates law. Great. Thanks, Ismail. On the first point, actually, there's a upcoming webinar with the Faces in Public Life and the Ignatian Solidarity Network, addressing on how to have conversations about when people are afraid. So that touches on anti-Islam sentiment as well as anti-immigrant sentiment. And I'm sure Kim will be sending around information about that, correct? There was also a really good study that came out. Well, it was a synthesis of a number of studies by the National Academy of Science talking about this jobs issue, and are immigrants actually taking away jobs? And I'd encourage you, if you're interested in more details, I'd encourage you to look at that, and that's kind of the evidence-based approach. Sometimes the evidence-based approach doesn't work. Sometimes it is talking about how can we create a human connection to immigrants. I think the personal story is an important way to overcome fear. But if you want the evidentiary context, that report came out about 2 weeks ago. And if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you a copy of that as well. Probably should have included that link. And to the second question with Cates law, so the context of Cates law was there was a shooting in San Francisco, and it was an individual who had crossed the border a couple of times, had been in jail for a couple of times, and the San Francisco, I guess it was the Sheriff's Department, had released that individual because San Francisco was a sanctuary city, and said that if ICE wanted to continue to detain that person, then they should have put out a warrant for that person's arrest instead of just using this questionable detainer system. So that individual was then released and ended up killing a woman whose name is Kate. And that inspired a lot of public outrage. And taking the fact that that person who had killed Kate had several times crossed the border, that was the inspiration for saying, well, we should increase the punishment for illegal reentry. And that's when it became, when that proposal for a mandatory minimum sentence emerged. Right now, the average sentence for illegal reentry is between 1 to 2 years, unless somebody is able to take a plea bargain down to the crime of illegal entry. So to dramatically increase the amount of time that someone would face in jail. And one of our concerns with that is that the people who are most likely to cross back into the United States are the people who have the best reason to be in the country, either because A, they have children who live in the United States who are U.S. citizens and want to be back with their kids, or B, because they're fleeing some sort of very grave violence and haven't had the chance to seek asylum. So we think that those two things shouldn't be punished with 5 years in jail. because actually with these reentry sentences, you're going against the very people who maybe could add the most to our country. I don't know if that's helpful context or if you have a follow-up question on that particular law.
Thank you.
Okay.
Folks, I know we're a few minutes over right now. Are there any, we could probably take one last question and then we'll need to wrap it up, but Joanna has offered her email address, so I'm putting it out there that you can ask her questions as well via email.
Yeah, I'm more than
any last questions? All right, well, you might get a bunch of emails, Joanna, so thank you for
no problem.
your fantastic presentation. Yeah.
I was just going to think, will you share my email address with people, or people want to write it down right now?
I can send a follow-up to everyone who participated in the webinar with your email address, and I will also include a link to this presentation right away, and then we'll get the full webinar posted by early next week. So thank you, Joanna, so much for a great presentation and for the question and answer session. This was really, I learn something new every time I listen to you speak, so we really appreciate you being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good luck in your preparations for the Advocacy Day. Please let ISN know if we can do anything to support you as well. We are planning to post some more Advocacy Day resources in the next day or so on the Advocacy Day page, including these webinars. So be on the lookout on the website as well for some more ways that you can get ready for your meetings. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for participating.
Thank you. Awesome.